The winter of 1877 came down on the Blackwood Valley like a hammer. It was not a slow, creeping cold that gave a person time to prepare, to acclimate the soul to the hardship ahead. It was a sudden, violent arrival, a declaration of war from the sky and the earth. The wind came first, a thief that stole the last of the autumn warmth from the air and stripped the final, stubborn leaves from the aspen trees, leaving them like skeletons against a bruised purple sky. The cold followed, settling into the valley floor like a physical weight, pressing down on the thin roofs of the settlers' cabins and seeping through the walls with the persistence of rising water. This was a cold that had teeth. It was a living thing, a predator that hunted for the smallest crack, the slightest gap in a man's defenses. It found its way through the mud, chinking between logs, no matter how carefully it had been applied. It breathed its icy breath under doors and around window frames, painting the inside of the glass with intricate, beautiful patterns of frost that belied their lethal touch. At night, families would huddle around their cast-iron stoves, feeding them a constant diet of precious, hard-won timber, only to feel the cold radiate from the walls behind them, a constant, silent pressure on their backs. The settlers of Blackwood Valley were not soft people. They were homesteaders, miners, and trappers, souls hardened by necessity and accustomed to the cyclical struggle for survival. They knew winter. They understood its demands. They had built their cabins the way their fathers and grandfathers had, with sturdy logs felled from the surrounding forest, notched and stacked with practiced skill. They laid stone foundations, shallow but solid, just enough to lift the first course of logs from the damp earth. This was the way it was done. It was the only way they knew. But this winter was different. The cold was deeper, more profound. It sank into the very ground, which had been saturated by late, heavy autumn rains. The familiar routines of survival began to fail. Wood piles that were meant to last until March were already half gone by December. The constant fires made the cabins smoky and dry, but the warmth never truly reached the corners. Children coughed in their sleep, and their parents lay awake, listening to the house groaning under the strain of the freeze. The sound was a constant, low moan, the timber contracting in the brutal temperature, the nails shrieking in their holes. In every one of the dozen cabins scattered through the valley, the story was the same. A man would wake in the pre-dawn dark to find the water in the bucket by the door frozen solid. A woman would pull blankets tighter around her children, only to feel a draft like a knife cutting through the small room. They fought back with the tools they had, stuffing rags into cracks, nailing hides over the loosest parts of the wall, and always feeding the fire. But they were losing. The cold was winning. It was a siege, and their homes were proving to be terribly inadequate fortresses. They were living in a state of shared, unspoken desperation, each family fighting the same battle within their own four walls, all of them adhering to the same flawed, traditional methods that were failing them all. It was in this atmosphere of quiet crisis that Elara began to dig. She was a widow, her husband taken by a logging accident the spring before, and she was seen by the community as a figure of quiet pity. She was an outsider, not by birth, but by her husband's memory. He had been an engineer from the old country, a man full of strange ideas about stress and load, about hydrology and thermal principles. He had spoken a language of numbers and drawings that the other men found peculiar, even foolish. Now he was gone, and Elara was left with his books, his tools, and his voice in her memory. While her neighbors were frantically cutting more wood and rechinking their log walls with frozen mud and moss, Elara did something that struck them as profoundly strange. She chose a small, sheltered spot on her claim, a gentle slope that caught the morning sun, and she began to mark out a rectangle in the hard, unyielding ground. It was not a large rectangle, smaller than a typical cabin footprint. Then she took up a pickaxe and a shovel and began to break the earth. The sound of her tools striking the frozen dirt was a sharp, lonely counterpoint to the ring of axes in the woods. Her idea, gleaned from her husband's worn journals and her own memories of his talk, was simple in principle, but radical in practice. The air was the enemy, he had always said. The air was volatile, subject to the whims of the wind and the sun. But the earth, the deep earth, was constant. Below the reach of the frost, the ground held a steady, cool temperature, a vast reservoir of thermal stability. The greatest winter shelter was not one that stood up against the cold, but one that nestled into the protection of the earth itself. She was not building a cabin. She was building a shelter that was part of the hill. The community's reaction was swift and predictable. At first, it was simple curiosity. Men would stop on their way back from the woods, leaning on their axes and watching her solitary labor. "What are you building there, Alara?" one asked, his tone betraying a hint of amusement. "A root cellar?" She paused, wiping sweat from her brow even in the freezing air, her breath pluming in front of her. "A home," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The man chuckled, a sound that didn't carry much warmth. "A home? In a hole in the ground? You'll flood in the spring and freeze in the winter. A house needs to stand tall, shed the snow." He shook his head and walked away, sharing the story with others. The word spread quickly. The widow was digging her own grave. The skepticism soon curdled into open mockery. The children, echoing their parents, would sometimes gather at a distance and chant, "Elara's digging a mud hole. Elara's going to live with the moles." The women would whisper at the communal well, shaking their heads with a mixture of pity and condescension. They saw her as a woman unmoored by grief, driven to madness by loneliness and the foolish notions of her dead, foreign husband. Thomas was the most vocal of her critics. He was the valley's unofficial master builder, a man whose hands had notched the logs for half the cabins in the settlement. He was a large man, confident in his knowledge, proud of his craft. He saw Elara's project not just as foolish, but as an insult to the proven ways of their ancestors. He approached her one afternoon, his shadow falling over her work. "Woman," he began, his voice a low rumble of authority. "This is dangerous. The ground here is unstable. The first heavy rain will collapse these walls on top of you, and the damp will get into your bones. You'll be sick before the new year." He gestured dismissively at the growing pit. "This is not how a house is built. A foundation needs to be on the ground, not in it." Elara straightened up, her back aching from the hours of labor. She looked at the hole, then back at him. "The frost line," she said simply. "The foundation must be below the frost line." Thomas laughed, a loud, booming sound that echoed in the cold air. "The frost line? That's something for building bridges, not cabins. You're wasting your time and what little strength you have. Build a proper cabin on a proper stone footing. I will even help you raise the logs, for your husband's sake." It was an offer of charity wrapped in an assertion of his own superior wisdom. "Thank you, Thomas," she replied, her tone even, betraying no anger. "But this is the way I will build." He stared at her for a long moment, his face a mask of disbelief and frustration. He saw not a determined innovator, but a stubborn, grieving fool. He shook his head again, turned on his heel, and left her alone with her digging. The laughter of the community became a wall of sound she had to push through every day. But she did not stop. She had her husband's drawings, his careful calculations, and a deep, abiding faith in the logic he had taught her. She worked on, alone. The work was brutal. The topsoil was frozen solid, and she had to use the heavy pickaxe to break it into chunks, which she then pried out with the shovel. Below that was a layer of dense, wet clay mixed with stone. Each shovelful was a dead weight, that strained the muscles in her arms and back. She worked from the first light of dawn until her hands were too numb and her body too exhausted to continue. She did not rush. Every movement was deliberate, every swing of the pick measured. She was not just digging a hole, she was shaping a space, creating a foundation that had to be perfect. As she dug deeper, past the reach of the season's frost, the earth changed. It became softer, easier to work. The air in the pit felt different, still and strangely mild compared to the biting wind above. She was descending into a different world, a place governed by the slow, ancient rhythms of the earth, not the frantic, violent changes of the weather. She dug until the pit was nearly 7 feet deep at the back, sloping gently up to about 4 feet at the front. While she toiled in her pit, the rest of the valley was a hive of frantic, traditional activity. Thomas and the other men were adding new layers of mud to their cabin walls, a task made difficult by the fact that the water they used to mix it kept freezing. They nailed thick pine boughs against the north-facing walls, a folk remedy against the wind that did little more than collect snow. They spent their days chopping, splitting, and stacking firewood, creating small mountains of fuel that seemed to shrink with alarming speed each night. Their work was a flurry of activity, a visible and noisy struggle against the encroaching winter. They finished their preparations, declared themselves ready, and settled in to endure, casting pitying glances toward the woman still laboring in her hole in the ground. Elara's work, by contrast, was slow, quiet, and methodical. Once the excavation was complete, she began the most critical phase, the foundation and drainage. This was the heart of her husband's design, the part that Thomas and the others could not comprehend. She spent a week hauling stones by wheelbarrow from a nearby creek bed. She chose them carefully, not the big, rounded boulders they used for their own shallow footings, but smaller, fist-sized rocks, angular and sharp. She lined the entire bottom of the pit with a thick layer of these stones, creating a bed that would allow any moisture to drain away. Around the perimeter, where the walls would stand, she dug a deeper trench and filled it with yet more gravel. Then came the walls. She used the largest, flattest stones she could find for the base, setting them deep in her drainage trench, below the depth the frost could ever reach. She had learned the art of dry stacking from her husband, fitting the stones together like a complex puzzle, using smaller shims to lock them in place. The back wall and the 2 side walls were built directly against the excavated earth. They were not just walls of a house. They were retaining walls, designed to hold back the immense pressure of the surrounding ground, and, more importantly, to draw its thermal stability into the living space. The front-facing wall, the one with the planned doorway and a single small window, was built of logs, but in a way the valley had never seen. They were thick, squared-off timbers, carefully joined. But behind them, she built a second, interior wall, leaving a gap of several inches between the two. This space, her husband's notes explained, she would later fill with dried moss and sawdust, creating an insulated barrier that was far more effective than a single, solid wall of even the thickest logs. The principle was simple. It was the trapped, still air that provided the best insulation, not the wood itself. Waterproofing was the final, crucial step. She had spent the last of her money on several barrels of pine tar, a foul-smelling, sticky substance that the others used only for sealing boat hulls. They had mocked her for this extravagance. She heated the tar over a fire and painstakingly painted the entire exterior of the stone walls that were in contact with the earth. She applied coat after coat, forcing the black liquid into every crack and crevice until the walls were encased in a thick, gleaming, waterproof skin. Over this, she packed a layer of the densest clay she had dug from the pit, creating a final barrier against the damp. The roof was low-pitched, designed to hold a thick blanket of insulating snow rather than shed it. The rafters were heavy beams, and the sheathing was made of thick, rough-sawn planks. The most peculiar part was the chimney. Instead of a straight stone column rising from the stove, hers was a complex structure of brick and clay pipe that ran horizontally for several feet within a stone bench before venting outside. It was a masonry heater, a concept from the old country. The design was meant to capture the heat from the smoke, warming the massive stone bench long after the fire itself had died down. It was inefficient to build, but incredibly efficient to use. By the time the first real snows of the deep winter began to fall, her strange, half-buried home was complete. From a distance, it barely looked like a house at all, just a low mound in the hillside with a single door and a wisp of smoke rising from a short chimney pipe. The crisis arrived not with a bang, but with a silent, crystalline intensification of the cold. In the second week of January, the wind died completely. The sky cleared to a pale, unforgiving blue. The temperature, which had been hovering in the single digits, plummeted. It fell to 10 below zero, then 20, then an almost unbelievable 30 below. The air became so cold it felt sharp in the lungs, and exposed skin would freeze in minutes. A profound, deathly stillness settled over Blackwood Valley. The snow squeaked underfoot with a sound like tearing fabric. Trees in the forest, their sap frozen solid, began to split open with explosive cracks that sounded like rifle shots in the silent air. This was the moment the earth began its terrible work. The moisture in the sodden ground, which had been held in a state of simple frost, now froze to a depth of 4, then 5 feet. As the water in the soil turned to ice, it expanded with immense, inexorable force. It was a power that could lift boulders and shatter rock. Against the shallow stone foundations of the settlers' cabins, it acted like a giant, slow-motion jack. The ground swelled upwards, pushing the foundation stones with it. The failures began subtly. A door that had closed snugly the night before would no longer fit its frame. A window pane, stressed by the twisting wall, would crack with a sharp ping. Then the more serious damage began. With a groan of tortured wood, a main support beam in one cabin shifted, shoved upwards by the heaving foundation beneath it. In another house, a long, jagged crack appeared in the chinking, opening a gap a man could put his hand through. The cold, no longer a seep or a draft, began to pour into the homes like a flood. Panic began to set in. The settlers were now feeding their stoves around the clock, burning through their wood at a terrifying rate. But the heat was simply being sucked out through the new, ever-widening cracks. The interiors of the cabins became dangerously cold, with temperatures barely rising above freezing, even with a fire roaring. Families abandoned their beds and slept on the floor in a tight circle around the stove, wrapped in every blanket and hide they owned. The constant groaning sound of their houses being slowly torn apart by the frost was the soundtrack to their sleepless nights. Thomas, the master builder, was beside himself. His own home, the one he had built with such pride, was one of the worst affected. A massive, diagonal crack had split the stone chimney from the hearth to the ceiling, rendering it unsafe to use. His family was freezing. Meanwhile, inside her earth-sheltered home, Ilara was warm. The great cold that held the valley in its grip was a distant, abstract concept. The ground outside her walls was frozen solid, a thick crust of iron-hard earth. But her foundation, resting on its bed of drainage gravel far below the frost line, was unmoved. The frozen soil pressed against her waterproofed walls, but instead of a destructive force, it became part of her insulation. The earth itself was her shield. The thick blanket of snow on her low-pitched roof added another layer of protection, keeping the modest heat from the masonry stove from escaping. The stove itself was a miracle of efficiency. She kept only a small, slow-burning fire going for a few hours in the morning and a few in the evening. The heat was absorbed by the massive stone bench, which then radiated a gentle, steady warmth throughout the small space for the rest of the day and night. The air was calm and still. There were no drafts. The temperature inside her home never dropped below 55 degrees. She had used less than a quarter of the wood her neighbors had already burned through. She sat in the quiet, reading one of her husband's books by the light of a single candle, listening to the silence. There were no groans, no cracks, no shrieks of stressed wood. Her house was at peace with the winter, not at war with it. The contrast was absolute. In the valley, men fought a desperate, losing battle, their homes breaking around them. Their world was loud with the sounds of failure, the wind whistling through new cracks, the shivering of their children, the constant, hungry roar of the fire consuming their fuel. In the hill, Elara lived in a pocket of quiet stability. Her world was silent, warm, and safe. The principles her husband had taught her, the ones the community had laughed at, were being proven not just correct, but life-saving. The great storm, the ultimate test, had arrived, and her small, humble shelter was passing with a quiet, unassailable strength. The traditional cabins, built with the pride of generations, were failing catastrophically. Thomas lasted 3 days in his broken home. On the third night, the temperature inside his main room, despite a small, desperate fire in the open hearth, dropped to 20 degrees. His youngest son had developed a deep, rattling cough, and his wife's face was pale with fear and exhaustion. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Survival was the only thing that mattered. Just before dawn, wrapped in his thickest coat, he left his suffering family and walked through the brutal, still cold, toward the low mound on the hillside he had once so openly ridiculed. The journey was short, but it felt like a mile. The air was so cold it burned his throat. Every cabin he passed was a picture of defeat. He saw the frantic, flickering light of fires through windows thick with frost, heard the muffled sounds of coughing, and saw the desperate, makeshift repairs on the walls. He walked past a woodpile that was nearly gone, a testament to a hopeless fight. He felt a profound sense of failure, not just as a builder, but as a protector of his family. Everything he thought he knew, every skill he had taken pride in, had been proven worthless by this winter. He was wrong. He was profoundly, dangerously wrong. He reached Elara's door and hesitated. He could see no light from the window, heard no sound from within. For a terrifying moment, he wondered if his warnings had been right after all, if she lay frozen inside. He raised a trembling, mittened hand and knocked. The sound was unnervingly loud in the great silence. The door opened almost immediately. Elara stood there, holding a small candle. She was not wrapped in furs or huddled in blankets. She wore a simple wool dress. Behind her, the candlelight illuminated a small, calm, and unbelievably warm space. A wave of heat washed over him, so starkly different from the outside air that it felt like a physical blow. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overworked stove, but a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to emanate from the very walls. He stared, speechless. He saw the smooth stone walls, the heavy-beamed ceiling, the earthen floor covered with simple, woven rugs. He saw the massive stone bench next to the small stove, which held only a few glowing embers. There were no drafts, no frost on the small window, no sense of struggle. There was only peace. He looked at Elara, his face a mixture of awe, shame, and desperation. The words he had planned, the excuses, the justifications, all died in his throat. Elara did not gloat. She did not say, "I told you so," She saw the exhaustion in his face, the fear in his eyes, and she simply stepped back. "Come in, Thomas," she said, her voice soft. "You look frozen through." He stumbled inside and she closed the door, shutting out the terrible cold. The silence of the small home enveloped him. He took off his mittens, his fingers aching as the warmth returned to them. He looked around the room, his builder's eye taking in the details he had once scorned. He saw the genius of the deep foundation, the brilliance of the insulated walls, the quiet efficiency of the masonry heater. It was all so simple, so logical, and he had laughed at it. He had led the chorus of mockery against this woman, and she had been right all along. She handed him a tin cup of hot tea. He took it, his hands shaking slightly. He sat on the edge of the warm stone bench, the heat seeping into his weary body. He felt the shame wash over him, hot and sharp. "My boy is sick," he said, his voice cracking. "My house, it's broken. The frost, it's split the foundation. The walls are cracked open." He looked up at her, his eyes pleading. "How?" he asked, the single word carrying the weight of his entire world being turned upside down. "How is it so warm in here?" Ilara sat down not far from him, her expression one of calm compassion. "The earth," she said simply. "The house is borrowing its warmth from the earth. The foundation is too deep for the frost to move. The walls hold the heat instead of letting it escape." She spoke not as a victor explaining her strategy, but as a teacher sharing a fundamental truth. Her triumph was not in his defeat, but in the simple, undeniable fact that her creation worked. It was a quiet triumph, as solid and unassuming as the stone walls around them. Thomas didn't return to his own home right away. He sent a message with another neighbor, telling his wife to bring the children to Ilara's shelter. Within the hour, his family was huddled in the life-saving warmth, his sick son wrapped in blankets and sleeping peacefully for the first time in days on the warm bench. The news of this act, and of the impossible warmth inside the widow's sunken house, spread through the frozen valley like a slow-burning fire. One by one, then in small, grim-faced groups, other settlers made the same pilgrimage Thomas had. They came not to mock, but to see. They knocked on her door, their faces etched with desperation, and Ilara let them all in. The small space became crowded with the valley's inhabitants, each one reacting with the same stunned silence as they stepped from the lethal cold into the gentle, steady warmth. They looked at their own children, shivering and coughing, and then at the calm, safe interior of the house they had called a mud hole. The laughter was gone, replaced by a profound and humbling silence. They saw the proof of their own ignorance, and the evidence of a wisdom they had been too proud to recognize. A few days later, once the worst of the cold snap had broken, though the winter remained fierce, Thomas came to her again. This time he was not seeking refuge. He came alone and stood before her, his hat in his hands, his head bowed. The arrogance was gone, stripped away by the hard lessons of the freeze. He looked like a man who had been remade. "Ilara," he said, his voice low and heavy with sincerity. "I was a fool, a proud, blind fool. I mocked you. I turned others against you, and I was wrong. My pride nearly cost my family their lives." He looked up, and she could see the genuine remorse in his eyes. "What you have built here, it is the only honest house in this whole valley. It is the only one that understands the winter." He took a deep breath. "Teach me," he said. It was not a request, it was a plea. "Teach me how you did this, so that we may all survive." That moment was the turning point for the entire community. The valley's most respected builder, its most vocal skeptic, had become the first student. Ilara took no payment, sought no praise. She simply shared what she knew. She took a piece of charcoal and, on a smoothed slab of slate, she drew the diagrams her husband had once drawn for her. She explained the concept of the frost line, showing them how deep they had to dig to find stable ground. She detailed the necessity of a drainage bed, explaining how water was the engine of the frost's destruction, and how they had to give it a place to go. She explained thermal mass, using the stone bench as her example. The stone breathes the heat in, she told the small, humbled crowd gathered in her home, and then it breathes it out slowly. It holds the warmth for you. A log wall just lets the warmth run away. She broke down the principles of insulated air gaps, of passive solar orientation, of proper ventilation to control dampness. She answered every question with patience and clarity, demystifying the knowledge that had saved her. She gave her wisdom away as freely as she had offered them the warmth of her fire, holding nothing back. The men who had once leaned on their axes and laughed now leaned forward, listening with rapt attention, their faces serious with the weight of this new, vital understanding. When the spring thaw finally came, it revealed the full extent of the winter's devastation. Nearly every cabin in Blackwood Valley had suffered catastrophic damage. Foundations were shattered, walls were warped, and roofs had been twisted out of shape. The settlement looked like it had been struck by an earthquake. But the thaw did not bring despair. It brought a quiet, determined resolve. The ground that had been their enemy was about to become their greatest ally. The sounds of that spring were different. Instead of the rhythmic thud of axes felling trees for new logs, the valley was filled with the scrape and ring of shovels and pickaxes striking the earth. Under the guidance of Thomas, who now worked as Elara's most devoted apprentice, the community began to rebuild. But they were not rebuilding their old, flawed cabins. They were digging. In front of every broken home, a new, deeper rectangle was being carved out of the earth. The landscape of the settlement physically changed. The tall, proud log cabins were slowly being replaced by low-profile, earth-bermed structures. The work was communal. Men who had once jealously guarded their own claims now worked side by side, helping a neighbor dig a foundation trench or haul stones for his walls. They followed Elara's designs meticulously, no longer questioning the strange new methods, but embracing them with the fervor of converts. They learned to lay drainage fields, to dry stack stone against the earth, to build masonry heaters. Elara moved among the work sites, a quiet, respected figure, offering advice and inspecting the work, ensuring the crucial principles were understood and followed correctly. The story of the winter of 1877 and the sunken cabins of Blackwood Valley began to travel. A surveyor, mapping the territory, stumbled upon the transformed settlement and was astonished by the unique construction. He spent a week there, taking notes and making sketches, and his report was eventually published in a gazette back east. Travelers and new settlers heading for the territories heard the tale and would often detour through the valley to see the strange, successful homes for themselves. They came to learn the new way of building, a method born from an outsider's knowledge and forged in the crucible of a devastating winter. The quiet, humble idea of a lone widow began to spread, seed by seed, across the frontier. Years passed. Blackwood Valley did not just survive, it thrived. The new homes were warm in the winter, cool in the summer, and safe from the whims of the harshest weather. The settlers burned a fraction of the wood they once had, leaving more of the forest standing. They were healthier, safer, and more secure. Elara lived to a ripe old age, a revered matriarch in the community she had inadvertently saved. She never boasted of her role, never reminded them of their past foolishness. She didn't have to. The proof was all around her, in the dozen warm, safe homes nestled into the protective embrace of the earth. The valley itself was her monument. The ultimate lesson of that brutal winter was not about engineering or construction, but about the nature of wisdom. It was a lesson in humility, a reminder that the most valuable knowledge is often found where it is least expected, in the quiet voice that dares to challenge the loud chorus of tradition. It proved that true strength is not about standing tall and defiant against the forces of nature, but about having the wisdom to bend, to adapt, and to find shelter in the embrace of the world itself. The settlers of Blackwood Valley learned that the earth they had struggled to tame was not an adversary to be conquered, but a partner to be understood, a source of profound and enduring strength, waiting patiently for those humble enough to listen.